Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt at the Oracle. Welcome to the first episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. We are having something of a soft launch. We are still in a little bit of beta mode. In general, the Roundtable can be thought of as a DFS version of Around the Horn, except hopefully with less confrontation and douchebaggery. Although the fact that I said douchebaggery might not be promising for the future of the show. But we're testing out the concept. Ideally, the show will be a forum in which we can bring together some great thinkers, great DFS players, some of the favorite contributors on the site, and some fantastic guests who do work elsewhere, and we can talk about a particular DFS topic. Now, in some cases, the roundtable will be very topical and of the moment, perhaps focus on a particular slate, and in other cases, the show will be focused on larger ideas or trends, and this first episode will be one of those shows. With the NFL season now officially over, we're going to talk about how DFS players can make the transition from NFL to NBA. We're going to talk about the similarities, the differences, how to evaluate players, cash game, and tournament strategies, all of that. So let's jump into it. With me on the show are a couple of fellow lab rats, as it were. I am pleased to be joined by Persson on Twitter at DoppelSykes and John Daigle at NotJDaigle. Bros, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm just hanging out at the Bobon Labs, just getting ready to do another pod after this, obviously. I just had one quick question. Do you consider Woody Page a douchebag? Because that's kind of what I'm going for here.
No, if you think he's cool, then I think he's very cool.
He's cool.
All right, there we go.
If those are the Bobon Labs, then this must be the illiterate labs, because the chalkboard behind me is supposed to be a funny quote such as Woody Page would do. But when I was writing it, I thought when I stared into the computer that it was the correct way, so I wrote it backwards. So now, rather, when you walk in the door, it just looks like I'm just really creepy because I'm sitting in front of backwards alphabet as opposed to a funny message. But per our discussion before the podcast, we're just going to leave it. Screw it. We've come too far.
Maybe it's not creepy. Maybe it's just genius. Of course, I guess it could be creepy genius. That's also possible. But bros, thank you both for being on the show. And then, of course, we are very excited to be joined by special guest Chris Raybon, the senior DFS editor at 444.com and the host of the DFS MVP podcast. You can follow him on Twitter at, of course, Chris Raybon. Chris, I got to say, you're looking fresh over the internet. I can smell your DFS studliness. How's it going, man?
How's it going, Matt? Thanks for having me on. Thank you for the kind words. It's actually funny. I think last time we did a podcast, we had to work around my haircut. This week, I'm actually getting it tomorrow. So this is like my most scruffy that you'll probably see me. But
that was a little bit of a humble brag. It's like, this is the least scruffy you're ever going to see me, and I'm still looking good.
Got to start it off right. Douchebaggery, right?
Exactly.
Warming it up. Just warming it up.
Warming up the onion, not the onion, the oven of douchebagness. All right, but guys, let's jump into this. We have just concluded a glorious 5-month run of NFL DFS. And for those of us who aren't total degenerates yet, we're not really sure about how to make the transition from the gridiron to the hardwood. So let's talk about that. Chris, let's start with you. What are the fundamentals of NFL DFS that you think can be applied to NBA?
That's a great question. The first thing is definitely, just like the NFL, you want to be using some type of value-based points per dollar model as your base. And, of course, that's going to use projections and then player salaries. And then you want to pay attention to opportunity, just like you do in NFL. You're paying attention to snaps. You're paying attention to attempts, touches, etc. In the NBA, it's going to be minutes, usage, and touches as well. And then just as in the NFL, when you're playing cash games, you're looking for consistent players. And then in tournaments, you're taking chances on more volatile players. You also want to be doing that in the NBA. So those are three of the basic fundamentals from the NFL that I think apply to NBA.
All right, Jay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, as Woody Page usually does. But as far as fundamentals, I think it's very similar roster construction that's applied to both sports. Obviously, for cash, you like Chris said, you want to target safe, high floor players sprinkled in with value plays that you find on any given slate. And then tournaments, you want high upside, relatively contrarian plays. But I think basically the fundamentals of DFS should remain the same kind of regardless of what sport you're in, but the intricacies of each sport change as you kind of break them down more in depth.
All right, John, do you disagree with these guys in any way?
First of all, going last in these podcasts is definitely going to suck because they're just going to steal all the points. But no, if I can get specific really quick, I was actually going to say that I don't think enough people tend to look at the utility spots because much like football, as Peter Jennings, whatever, used to say in the football podcast, is that he's looking for that quote-unquote Monday night hammer. But in basketball, we essentially have that Monday night hammer every single night. It's the final tip-off of the night. But I don't think people look at the tip-off times, which are basically the equivalent of a matchup, like to have a questionable 4K, 5K player, whatever he might be, but then not have him in a utility spot. Like that could essentially mean that you're having to replace him if out with let's say he's a shooting guard. You're replacing him with a shooting guard rather than keeping him in your utility spot and instead replacing him with having a plethora of selections. So just looking at tip-off times in general is so important. That way you can always be considering swapping your lineup. Not the lineup swap of death, of course, but good swaps.
Right. Really intriguing point there about it's an everyday game. And let's hit on that. NBA, it's an everyday game. We're transitioning away from a game that we played once per week. How does the daily basis of NBA impact your approach? And does it kind of maybe change your GPP strategies in any way? I don't know if that's something that would factor in, but Jay, what are your thoughts?
I'm still stuck on this Monday night hammer that Pete. I never heard that, but I'll have to.
Have you never heard Pete say Monday night hammer? He's mentioned it quite. That and fantasy fitness are his two go-tos.
I try to tune Pete out, really.
Okay, fair enough.
But back to the question. I mean, first off, most importantly, I think NBA is a whole different animal. I think it's a lot more difficult from the standpoint that's much more of a grind than NFL. That's not to lessen anyone who specializes in NFL, but you have a whole week to prepare, and the grind in NBA is real if you're playing all these slates every night. So I think time is very valuable, and more importantly, you're making very, very quick decisions often. So I think that's a big thing that people might not be ready to do in NFL. You don't really have as many late scratches. So with that said, my approach changes. I think, it's just important to be as prepared as possible before heading into a slate. I think it's perfectly fine to skip a slate here and there, take a day off, which in NFL you don't really want to, but NBA, I think it's beneficial. You could, if you have other duties or obligations to fulfill that would cut into your time making lineups, you don't need to play that night. So I think if you rush it, you have the chance to lose your bankroll, your house, your wife, your 1969 Joe Namath autographed helmet, pretty much, everything that matters to you. So I think it's important to kind of realize how much time goes into it that you have to devote.
John, do you have any thoughts on that, especially the idea of it's okay to skip slates? So, for instance, we are recording this on a Thursday. It's going to air on a Tuesday. But this day, it was a trash slate with 4 games. Would this have been an ideal one to skip? Or, just in general, kind of that point, and then the bigger point, how do you manage the daily grind of NBA?
I mean, if you can, then yeah, go for it. I wouldn't suggest say not skip it. I have zero self-respect though, so I'm not skipping anything. But for GPP strategy though, I really think the NBA grind is more about it's easier to know NBA exposure because you're seeing it on a nightly basis. And with things like DraftKings, price points are always just ridiculously falling or dropping on a nightly basis. 24 hours later, you're seeing $500 hikes in salaries. And so just watching that, and like Jay said, it's absolutely a grind, but just watching and paying attention to that is certainly helpful on a nightly basis.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what do you think?
I think a thing we haven't talked about yet is what's your process, what's your routine. You want to make sure you really have a good process and a routine nailed down because there is only going to be a short amount of time, so you don't want to be just kind of out there and not knowing exactly what you're going to do. You want to know that exactly how long your process is going to take you and exactly what you're going to do. You're not going to be able to watch as many games if you're one of those people in the NFL who, because you have a whole week, you can watch a ton of games on NFL Game Rewind. You're not going to be able to watch quite as many. You can watch your games on League Pass at night, but unless you're just doing this all day, You're not going to be able to watch as many NBA games. And, as far as losing your wife, the plus side to like losing your wife or something like that, because, is that, the next day there's another slate. And then if you win a lot of money that night, you can just go to the strip club.
You get a new wife.
And make it rain. Yeah. So, those are some things. And then, there's I don't think you do have to play every day either. I think you have to know when to skip a slate, when you're not going to be able to get your normal routine and your normal process and your normal research time in. You don't want to force it, because there is going to be so many days that you can play. And even if it's like a super small slate where you just don't feel good about the value, you don't feel like you can get an edge, it's really okay to skip slates. And another thing is that we don't do as much in the NFL is you can choose what slates to play in a given day. So sometimes there's a huge slate in a given day, maybe a 10 to 12 game slate. And you can say, you know what, I only want to play maybe the 8 o'clock express slate, or I only want to play the late game slate today. Whatever slate you feel gives you the best edge, I would concentrate on that rather than trying to just play just because the games are happening.
And at the same time, it probably goes without saying, but don't go chasing money in those express slates. Like, clearly, bankroll management is important here. But no, I feel like a lot of people will lose the early or the main, and then have 2 or 3 games, just the small slates that you probably shouldn't even play, to be honest, and just load up on those, hoping to catch up on their money. Clearly a no-no.
I'll counter that by saying that's why I play those express slates, to get the true DJ.
People catching up. Yeah. Okay. No, that's a great theory. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's what I was kind of alluding to. You want to research whatever slate that you're going to play in beforehand. So if you think that you can have an edge in the express slate or the late slate, then just research that and don't spend all your time researching the entire slate if you're not really going to play it. Really just know how to focus your research and choose your slates wisely.
It's basically just an ode to FanDuel Thursday football contest, where somebody we always enter, but then you don't play it really, because everyone is usually trying to fill up a head-to-head too with every single player in a Thursday. It's that's what we miss. So that's what we're trying to do here. Just avoid that.
Nice stuff there. And so we just mentioned bankroll management. Let's talk about that a little bit more. And John, I guess it's really your chance to shine right now in the leadoff spot. So give us what you got. Bankroll management, between the two sports, are there any big differences in how you think you should deploy your money?
I mean, I would think it's even more strict in basketball, since you are on a nightly timeline here. You can't go chasing the night after. You have to realize that it's every night is going to be different. You might be successful. It might come with bumps and bruises, but no matter what, you just have to stick to the plan. And I don't have anything more outside of just being consistent, because that's really what my strategy is. It's just consistency all the way through, no matter what. Don't go chasing. Don't ride a high. Just always stay in a flat plane.
All right, I hear you. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I play a lower percentage of my bankroll in the NBA than in the NFL, because in the NFL, as you mentioned, there are 20 weeks to play, or 16, 17, whatever you're playing. And also, I'm more conservative with the amount of money I allocate to GPPs, because the NBA is a lot more predictable than the NFL and then most sports on a nightly basis. I think it lends itself better to cash games if you have a good model, a good cash game process. And because of that, I put a lot less of my money in play into GPPs. In the NFL, it's more event-based. Contrarian plays are more important. Touchdowns create huge swings. So if you can find a cheap player that goes for 2 touchdowns in a game or something like that, or clears 100 yards and gets that bonus, it's a big difference maker. But in the NBA, that's not going to happen as much. So I'm a little more conservative with GPPs.
Hey, Chris, great stuff there. Can you talk just a little bit more specifically about some of the percentages that you use? Is it kind of a moving target just based on how you feel in any given slate, or do you stick with percentages pretty rigidly?
I do try to be consistent, because that is important, or you're not gonna maximize your gains. But usually in the NFL, I'm playing 15 to 20% of bankroll in a given week. In the NBA, that will go down to about 5 to 7.5% a night. So that's my current take. I know there's people that play a lot more. Some people might even play less. I think it depends on your bankroll, but I generally cut it in half for NBA as compared to NFL.
All right, I hear you. All right, Jay, bring us home. Thoughts on bankroll management?
Yeah, generally speaking, it's just a whole lot easier to get money down in NFL because of the volume on the board. So, yeah, I bet a lot more in NFL every Sunday than every night in NBA. I'm mainly a cash game player, so you can get pretty easily 1,000 head-to-head matches in NFL on any given Sunday and play 1,000 different people. So the chances of you losing all those 1,000 games playing 1,000 unique lineups are slim. And you can even break it down more and get into hedging and increase your action because really for 99% of people, there's essentially unlimited action in NFL. So I think you can definitely afford to put down more in NFL with all the action out there, and you can even hedge to, limit your risk a little bit. As far as GPPs, I think, I just generally bet more in NFL on GPPs anyways. Just with the bigger size tournaments, obviously, are a bit more attracting. But I don't think it's necessarily the same as cash games. Cash games are a bit harder to fill that many in NBA. So I think you can kind of use the same rules for NBA and NFL if you're strictly a tournament player.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we've been talking primarily about kind of DFS strategy. Let's talk a little bit more about the differences in the actual games themselves. So in the NFL, each position generally has a specific role. Your quarterback throws, your running back runs, your wide receiver catches. In the NBA, it seems like there's more fluidity between the positions, more avenues for guys to score points. Can you talk about the process of evaluating players? Like, for instance, what do you look for in guards, forwards, and centers? Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, for all positions, the first thing I'm looking for is minutes. I want especially in cash games, I want a guaranteed source of minutes. I don't want a player whose minutes jump from like 23 to 35 to 26. I want a guy who's playing 30-plus minutes a night. The next thing I'm looking at is usage rate. I want players that are going to be able to use possessions because no matter what position you're talking about, points is the most consistent statistic on a nightly basis besides minutes. Points is the most consistent fantasy scoring statistic on a nightly basis. So I want players that are going to get opportunities to score points. Now, when it comes to the differences between positions, for guards, I'm looking for guards that are going to lead the team in touches. I want a guard that is going to, as a point guard, be able to run the offense. He's not going to be one of those guys that plays off the ball a lot. If he's a shooting guard, I just want him to be, based on my projection model, getting a lot of minutes and, basically be a good value. I know a lot of shooting guards don't necessarily touch the ball as much anyway, so shooting guards is just more about finding a good value. And then as far as big men, again, looking at points and looking at rebound percentage, I want the big man I'm choosing to be the primary rebounder on a team. I want him to be in a situation where he is going to be around the rim. Sometimes you could have a power forward and he's playing an opposing power forward who's like a stretch four, and that will pull him away from the rim, and then his rebound opportunities will go down because rebounds are the second most reliable statistic except for point guards. So you really want rebounds in your bigs. And then as far as in small forwards, again, it's kind of like shooting guards. You just want a guy who's going to play a lot of minutes and is a good value according to your projection model, and you're looking for usage wherever possible, touches, things like that.
All right, Jay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, you definitely want these guys in cash games to have secure minutes, especially point guards, and you absolutely want like ball-dominant point guards, handle the pick and roll, ball handling portion, guys who can get you a good source of assists, obviously. Steals and threes are a bonus, specifically on DK for those threes. So those are things you look at there. Obviously, shooting guard, yeah, you want shooting guards to target kind of those guys that see a higher usage rate and they handle the ball more. Kind of like, James Harden obviously is the most expensive too, but players like him, Brandon Knight, who share point guard duties pretty much. Yeah, for small forwards, you nailed it. You kind of it depends. It's usually you're either paying up for like Durant or a high-priced elite player, or you're kind of not punting it, but you're kind of looking for these value guys that pop up due to other circumstances where, they show up well in your model. And then, yeah, big men are tricky because, foul trouble is a big concern. The centers are the most foul-prone players, obviously. So you're looking at guys who are safe in safe matchups, oversized advantages possibly as well. So it's kind of, it's the same as breaking down matchups in NFL. You're just doing it in a different sport. But the same principles apply. I think something that's very underlooked is to evaluate players is based on their teammates. So, I mean, I've seen so many times where like a point guard is out and a scoring big man, people will think, okay, his usage rate will climb and he's going to be a great play. Then you look at him without his point guard, his pick and roll buddy, then he kind of drops. He might shoot it as the same amount of shots as usual, but he's going to miss more. So I think understanding the teammates around the player you're looking at is also a strong evaluator.
All right, John, I'm going to ask you kind of the same question, but coming from the other side of this. So they've talked about how to identify guys you should play. Here's a question about how do you identify guys that you normally should play, but for certain matchups you probably should not play? How do you know when to fade the guys that ordinarily you would want to play?
Well, NBA I consider to be such a price point sport that usually I'm just looking for prices, and that's when I know to fade. It's not even honestly about exposure for me in the NBA. It's honestly just about salary. Like that will drive most of my decisions. But on the other end of the spectrum, I will say that rotations are a big part of this. Like, for instance, Trevor Ariza tonight, the last 9 to 12 games, I don't have it on me, but clearly he's starting at power forward. He's starting at the 4 for Houston, although his position is technically small forward. So if you look at the Suns' opponent plus minus in our models to power forwards, even though he's listed as a small forward, it's actually minus 1.4 below expectations. However, at small forward, it shows up positive. And so really, although he will play at the 3 a little bit, we still want to pay attention more to that 4 spot. So just paying attention to rotations like that can certainly help out when deciding whether or not to play a person against said defense.
All right.
And also, I actually got something to add there. I think another difference between the NFL and the NBA, at least to me, is I actually utilize defensive versus position less in the NBA. And instead, I'm looking at the overall, how the team defends certain things. So, for example, because every player plays multiple positions in the NBA usually, and a lot of players – positions do different things even within the same position. For example, you have power forwards who stay close to the rim, stretch fours and such. What I'm looking at, for example, if I'm thinking about rostering a good 3-point shooter and he's a shooting guard, I'm not just going to look at the shooting guard DVP. I'm going to look at how that team defends 3-pointers, period, because they might have just faced a bunch of shooting guards that don't shoot threes or something like that, and then their DVP will still be good. So I'm really looking at the overall team defense, their rebound differential, how many assists they give up, period. They might have faced a bunch of teams lately that maybe the point guard isn't necessarily the primary ball distributor or something like that, and they might have a good DVP versus point guards, but if they're giving up a lot of assists or a high assist percentage, I wouldn't shy away from playing a certain point guard against that team. So I think I really look at, overall defensive numbers, because that's more reflective of a team's defensive philosophy, how they rotate, do they close out on shooters, do they sit back in the pick and roll and allow open shots, how they're playing as a total team on defense, I think is more important in the NBA than just looking at individual DVP stats, because players play so many different positions and play so many different ways.
Yeah, it's kind of like poker. Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead, Jay?
No, you got it.
Oh, yeah, it's like how in poker you're not even really playing your own hand. You're playing the opponent. Like Denver, opposing off-ball guards. Like whoever is playing Denver shooting on the wing, I'm playing that guy mostly every night. No matter who is, blindly. I don't care. Centers against Boston, I'm usually playing, et cetera, et cetera. Like those positions, we know they are horrid at. And so immediately, those guys just slotting right into my lineup. Like Kyle Korver the other night. I think it was last week, Jay, when you mentioned on the podcast, Kyle Korver was even in my lineup, and it was ridiculous.
He did break his expected points, by the way.
Yeah, he did. I think he had like 24.5 points.
I think he had 19.4.
Okay, stop showing me up. For Kyle Korver this season, though, that's extraordinary. But like that low of salary, no one's on him. But the fact he's playing Denver, of course, I'm going to launch him in my lineup. Whatever, don't care.
Yeah, I think team defense is definitely more important, especially the way the NBA is kind of going now. We're seeing a kind of less ball dominant, on-ball defenders. I mean, we got Avery Bradley, Tony Allen, guys like that you can kind of avoid more so than you look at those guys, and if it's a ball stopper kind of guy, then that's worrisome. But, yeah, as far as, like, specific matchups that show up, especially on DraftKings with their DVP. I mean, that's something I don't even really look at all. I think you can definitely have an edge by looking above that and breaking it down on what kind of players they actually do stop.
I can't recall the last time I used their DVP, actually. Like, those numbers are just colors to me.
Well, you know what you use it for is to get ownership percentages based on players who have really good matchups. You can assume the general public will be on those guys.
All right, guys, let's move on. We mentioned the utility position before. Let's talk about that a little bit more and think of it kind of in the general terms of like the flex position. So you have the guard, the forward, right? You have different positions where different types of players can slot in. How do you approach the flex position? Like, what is your ideal type of flex player? John, what do you think?
I generally just allow the slate to decide for me, whatever it might be. But at the same time, like, we go in our lineup builder at FantasyLabs, and I generally see the pie chart be more purple because centers somehow always work their way into my flex positions. And it's probably because just at DraftKings, centers are generally cheaper. And since I do consider centers reliable, foul trouble, of course, inconsistent, whatever. But at their price point on DraftKings, then yeah, most of the time that's who I'm using in my flex.
All right. Jay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree as much as that it's totally slate dependent. It depends where the kind of the value lies and the size of the slate, obviously. So it's kind of tough to have a hard rule. But for cash, especially this season, I found myself usually going point guard or center in the flex, especially with the pricing for some of these centers. For a lot of these, we've seen like Brook Lopez underpriced. We've seen Vucevic underpriced. A lot of guys. So it's usually center, and that's usually where I go with my flex player or point guard, especially if value pops up there. I think it's pretty similar in NFL kind of in that you generally don't want to play like two tight ends, just like you don't usually want to play two shooting guards or even two small forwards in cash. But I think for tournaments, though, it's a whole different game where, we've seen plenty of times solid tournament lineups with unique lineups having two tight ends. And I think you wrote about this in your article where I think you can have unique lineups if you do go two shooting guards or multiple small forwards or whatnot. So I think it's different with cash first tournament.
Mm-hmm. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it definitely is less position related and more slate related than the NFL, because in the NFL, each position has a distinct level of consistency where, we're talking about tight ends, and tight ends are the most inconsistent players on a weekly basis, and then wide receivers are next, and then running backs are pretty much the most consistent, generally players you can use in your flex. So I think for the NBA, it really is more slate dependent. And one thing to just keep in mind is put the player, as we talked about before, with the latest tip-off in your flex position whenever possible.
All right. Now, this question might tie in a little bit with the idea of flexes, but in the NFL, there are sort of like tricks of the trade of different players you like to roster. So quarterbacks who can run, backup running backs who get a lot of touches, wide receivers who get a lot of targets. In the NBA, are there types of players that you think provide hidden DFS value?
Hidden value, that comes from, I think first and foremost, just minutes. Any player that's minimum price, that's going to get, say, about 25 or more minutes, that's going to be in the rotation, that's starting for somebody that's out in a given game. And then cheap big men who crash the boards. They can get they can even get a lot of putback opportunities, and those are cheap points. And if a center is starting, a cheap center is starting, just because he's the center, he'll likely, anytime there's a miss, he's the most likely player to get that rebound. Cheap point guards who will get touches. It really just comes down to players that are being put into larger roles in terms of hidden value. I guess it's not hidden. When you play a ton, nothing's really hidden. But those are some things you look for where, depending on what happens, people might not be on it. And then also on DraftKings, when you have the late swap, you can use this even more because not everybody is going to utilize that late swap. So, when a player, a lot of times you won't have the news about the later games when the first lineup locks at, say, 7 or 7:30, and there might be a player in a 9 o'clock or a 10:30 game that is out, and a player might get pushed pushed into a starting role, and you can now use him and swap him in, and you'll probably have an advantage just because not everybody is going to check for that and do that.
All right, John, any thoughts?
I don't know if it's really a secret, but outside of just strictly paying attention, like I wrote in a preview one time about an article I read. And I get up and I read the newspapers, the beat writers for every team. And I don't expect you to do that. Like, I have bags under my eyes and zero hair for a reason now. Like, I'm not doing it every morning. But outside of that, it's just like Chris said, it's minutes, honestly. It's not a secret. But, I mean, even like Brooklyn, every night they play, I have the worst discussion with myself about Wayne Ellington. It's like, on one side, 34 minutes. On the other side, he's shitty. So here I am having a discussion with myself, and I don't want to roster him, but at the same time, minutes are just absolute king.
All right, Jay, thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are some secrets. I mean, I think I understand what you're getting at, and that's we want to target players who kind of excel in these secondary stats, whether it's steals and blocks or even assists from non-point guards. I think we kind of got into it with the combo guards. I think that's it's as close as a comparison to a running quarterback is like, for example, the other night on FanDuel, Jeremy Lin was starting for Kemba Walker, and he was listed at shooting guard. So you're getting a point guard at shooting guard who will have the ball in his hand a lot, whereas, a lot of other shooting guards are spot-up shooters. Even Clay to an extent. So you have guys at shooting guard that you're kind of overpaying for generally. So when you have the opportunity to get a value guy there who's playing as a point guard listed as a shooting guard, that's obviously huge there. So I think the combo guard is probably the biggest way to find these extra points that makes sense.
All right. Great stuff there. I agree with you. I think you won that segment because that was the answer I was looking for. Now, there are a lot of sites that offer analytical tools that help you create lineups. FantasyLabs, of course, we have our player models, our new lineup generator. What role do models play for you in NBA? And then kind of thinking about this a little more, like what factors do you like to have in your models, like Vegas lines, things like that? How important is all of that stuff? Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, models are huge in NBA. I would argue even more so than the NFL because, as I spoke about before, the NBA players' statistics are more consistent on a nightly basis than they are in the NFL on a weekly basis. So to measure this, I've used something called coefficient of variation, which is CV, which is basically just what percentage a player's fantasy points or any given stat will vary from its average on a game-to-game basis. So in the NFL, the average player's CV it's about 55%. So whatever their average is on a nightly basis, whatever their average fantasy points is, it'll go up or down by 55% from game to game. In the NBA, every player is in the high to mid 30s. So quarterbacks in the NFL are the most consistent position. Their CV is about 45%, give or take. There'll be certain ones that have a little more, a little less. But in the NBA, every player is below that. So what that says is that in the NBA, you can trust your projections a higher to a larger degree than you can in the NFL. And that's because in the NFL you have touchdowns, which when you're projecting touchdowns at 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. Mm-hmm. In reality, you can only have 0 touchdowns, 1 touchdown, 2 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, or 4 or 5. So that has a large effect on your projections and makes them a little less accurate. However, in the NBA, on a given night, these stats are all counting stats. So, I mentioned points are the most consistent statistic, and then you have rebounds and assists are also pretty consistent. So on a nightly basis, your projections are going to be a lot more accurate. Therefore, your model is going to be of a lot more use to you. And then as far as Vegas lines, something I think was really interesting is Jonathan Bales of FantasyLabs, he actually wrote about in an article for his Roto Academy that a course called 5 Secrets that over-unders are actually negatively correlated with plus-minus for Vegas lines. So what that basically means is that, of course, the players in the games with the higher over-under totals, there's going to be tend to be more fantasy points scored and more overall points scored. But what it's saying is that sites are generally overvaluing the Vegas lines. So a lot of times you can find value just by looking for players in games with lower over-under totals, because even in a game where there's a low total, what will happen is there's still going to be fantasy points to be scored in every play. Even if players aren't scoring points by making field goals, there still could be steals. There still be blocks. There will still be a ton more rebounds if players aren't making as many shots. So there's always value to be found, really regardless of the Vegas lines. The one thing you do want to pay attention to with Vegas lines, in certain cases, is just the blowout factor. But even that, I think, can sometimes be overrated, because if a team does blow out another team, chances are that they'll racked up a lot of fantasy points doing so in the first 3 quarters or whatever. So those are just some things I think basically in a nutshell, your projections are going to be more accurate in the NBA. So models are more important than in the NFL.
Well, Chris, I have to say that was a very impressive nutshell, and congratulations on being the first guy on the show to drop Jonathan Bell's name. I believe you will get a check later after the show. Now, Jay, same question. What are your thoughts?
That up. What? Did you?
It's a good luck following that up.
Oh, no, it's all good. Good luck for you. You got a backwards chalkboard over there. But yeah, I mean, I'm all about the models, and I completely agree. I use them religiously in NBA and not as much in NFL because it's a bit harder to kind of pinpoint, where you want a guy at. So, and I also work, around the clock kind of dealing with the models. So, I live and die with the fan model, and my favorite part about it is that when I win, I credit myself, and when I lose, I just blame Justin. So I'm in like a really good spot where it's a win-win for me. But it's kind of a thing where other sites, obviously, we have a lot of sites out there that offer analytical tools, but these tools don't mean much if they're not used the right way, or set up the right way even. So firsthand, I know how much work gets put into our models. It's 24/7. It's around the clock. Like, I don't think John slept in like 2 months. I'm pretty sure.
There's a good chance. My board is backwards, by the way, so there is a great chance I haven't slept.
Yeah, and Justin gets no sleep. I don't get any sleep either. So, like, we're putting in a lot of work. Everything's updated in real time. Like, we have our Vegas lines obviously updated real time, but we're also tinkering with the models all day based on every piece of news information that comes out. So it's not like we just leave stuff there and let it sit when any vital piece of information is updated all throughout the day. So, I mean, I think models are the way to go. Obviously, I mean, if I didn't have FantasyLabs before FantasyLabs, I still did models. I mean, that's the most successful way to win in NBA specifically. So as far as the Vegas lines, I think it's interesting to compare NBA and NFL. I think NFL, the Vegas lines, like Chris made a great point in bringing up pricing. They over-adjust in some of those high games, high total games. I think NFL, the lines are really valuable in reading game script. You can get a lot of information out of that. Whereas NBA, these big spreads specifically are really more worrisome in case your player plays 75% of their, expected output. So blowouts are something to be concerned of, but I agree. I do think people overweight blowouts a little bit too much, especially in tournaments where you can find a lot of value kind of targeting these blowout games.
All right, John, thoughts?
Models are ever so important to me. And as much fun and as easy as it is to just blame Justin and yell at him, I think creating your own model is the way to go. Like, cater it to yourself. What are you looking for? Like, my model, for instance, I am admittedly a tournament player. I spend more time on tournament lineups. I put more pride into my tournament lineups. I just enjoy it more. I do a lot more of it. And so my model personally essentially takes it weighs minutes and ceiling more and basically forgets about floor. It should be called FU John because that's all it does mostly. But like, I'm forgetting about floor because I'm trying to win a tournament as a tournament player. I'm not trying to bubble. That's the worst thing you can do outside of finishing second place in one of the qualifiers. Like, you do not want to bubble any GPP. And so, yeah, I've catered my model to myself, which I feel like everyone should do. Yeah, and yell at Justin simultaneously.
Yeah, everyone should use their own models, especially if they want to get no sleep like everyone on this podcast. All right, now let's talk about cash game construction. What are the best practices? How do you find consistent high floor players? Jay, What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I actually created a video kind of on my exact cash game lineup construction earlier this season, and it's something I definitely want to go back to and make a few more on. But, I mean, basically, I utilize pretty much everything that we have to offer at FantasyLabs, especially starting with the FantasyLabs NBA Twitter account. Get all your news there, get all of Justin's wise jokes. He cracks on some people, which are always worth it. And,
always read the mention. Always read the mention.
Yeah, the mentions. Those will be the end of me one day. But and then I think you just gather all your information early in the day. Kind of, I use the fan model specifically to kind of formulate a base team. Read all of our NBA articles, related articles, to kind of get an idea going in what you're looking for. Because every slate's pretty different, so I think it's tough to have super hard rules. Like I never really go into a slate with a very hard rule of I'm going to pay up at point guard or whatever. It's always different on slate to slate. So I think throughout the day you kind of finalize what you want, you tweak the final lineup, and it's essentially solving a puzzle at the end. So I think looking at consistent high floor players, obviously in our models we kind of have that with our consistency rating and our floor rating. So you combine those with our expected points, and I mean that's a great start to a solid cash lineup.
All right, John, what do you think?
Remember that last question when I said I strictly play tournaments?
Yeah.
So we should go to Chris.
I want to put you on the spot. That's fine. We'll skip. Chris, what do you think?
No, actually.
No, we skipped you. We skipped you. Chris.
Okay, perfect. Go.
Yeah, you're done.
I'm going to stare at my board. Go.
Cash models, as Jay said, it's really about the floor and the consistency because, like I said before, in the NBA, there is a high level of predictability. So I think cash games are where your models are going to come into play the most, honestly. With tournaments, I'll go away from my models a little more just because I know that a lot of other people are going to be using models too. And sometimes you need that, that little one bolt of lightning that's just wouldn't show up in a model or something like that. So, but yeah, I'm in cash games. I think generally studs are something I'm usually playing at least one stud because I am not as concerned as I am in the NFL that salary is going to go to waste. In the NFL, because most players are varying more than 50% from their average, that means there's usually more than a 50% chance that they could just not live up to their high price. In the NBA, that's closer to about 30% chance. So you have a really good chance of a guy, even if he costs a lot of salary, you have a really good chance of him living up to his cost in the NBA. And then it's just about finding those value plays like we talked about before, and then just filling it in with an optimal lineup, really. I really trust the models a lot more as long as I think I have the minutes projected the way they're supposed to be. It's really about just throwing out that optimal lineup, or maybe if you want to go with a second lineup or something like that. But I really trust the numbers. I trust the points, the rebounds, and the assists. I don't rely on steals and blocks and three-pointers for cash games. If a player, is on a real hot streak with three-pointers, or he's getting a lot of steals or blocks lately and his salary has risen, that might be a red flag for me, just because those stats, they vary over 100% on a nightly basis. So a guy could have, 3 nights in a row of 0 steals, but then have like 2 nights in a row of like 3 steals each. And, it's really hard to predict because there's so few of them happening. But, points, rebounds, assists are, I could essentially throw out steals and blocks when I'm looking at cash games and just, project players based on points, rebounds, assists, turnovers, and minutes, and go from there and just trust the numbers.
All right, John, it's as if the entire show has been building to this moment, and this question was designed specifically for you. Let's talk about tournament lineup construction. What do you look for? How do you find upside? And then specifically, talk to us about stacking, because that's something that's really important in the NFL. How do you use it, or should you even use it in the NBA?
So I'm going to steal your role for just one moment. And I want to flip this question to Chris and Jay because I don't know the answer. And I'm very curious. On a nightly basis, I'm curious. Is there a definitive stacking matrix out there? Or are we just all going with the flow and assuming that it's one way or the other? Because I don't know either way. Personally, I game stack. And I've been successful game stacking. But it's much like the NFL, how we came into the year thinking only quarterback to tight end or quarterback to wide receiver. And then all of a sudden, by the end of the season, we realized that success is quarterback to wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, tight end 1, and running back, just team stacking. So, like, do we have a definitive matrix out there to lead the way on this, or are we still all just experimenting at this time?
Chris, go.
I don't, as far as I know, there's not a definitive matrix out there. One thing I will say is that I do stack in tournaments, but I don't force it. Just the same as NFL. This year, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different stacks that worked in the NFL, and there's also times when not stacking worked in the NFL. So I think it's really just dependent on the slate and the type of unique lineup. But one thing I will say, what tips me off, John, you mentioned game stacks, and I think that those are a very prudent thing to do, because one thing I look for is close spreads. Vegas lines. I know we said, in general, Vegas lines aren't as important, but when I see a close spread, that tips me off to the fact that a game may potentially go to overtime. If a game goes to overtime, especially if it's the only game of the slate that goes to overtime, you can gain a lot by game stacking. So, and I won't necessarily overdo it. I might just choose the opposing studs from the game, or maybe a point guard, and if their point guard leads the team in assists, and then they have a top scorer, I'll do the point guard to his fellow pick and roll man, or point guard to the team's top scorer, and stack those two players on each team, basically, and just to take advantage of a potential overtime situation that may occur. And also, just even in non-type of overtime or close spread games, I usually do like to sometimes stack opposing studs if there's two studs in the same game, because I think, if one stud, like if Kevin Durant goes nuts and scores like 50 and he's playing against, James Harden, James Harden will probably have to take it upon himself to keep up. So I think there is correlation there. I think the thing you want to be careful with stacking is when two players on a team are competing for the same type of stats, like if you have a power forward and a center, sometimes, they're probably, if one gets a rebound, that's probably going to hurt the other one. If you have two guards that, handle the ball a lot, I think, that's something you want to pay attention, avoid. But in general, it's opposing games. It's players from opposing games that I'm stacking and paying more attention to than necessarily players on the same team.
All right, Jay, drop some dimes.
I will. So I think the most beautiful thing about tournaments is that the strategy is always evolving. So, John, to your question, there is no answer, because the answer is always changing. It's game theory is always getting bigger and bigger. So we see these tournaments, and they're really dependent on buy-ins. I mean, you could throw cash lineups in now in like the 1K tournaments and be very profitable, because guys are, getting too fancy with being contrarian in some of these smaller field tournaments. I think we're going to see it big time when MLB starts, that it used to be you could print money stacking the 1 through 5 hitters, but now everybody's doing that. So the game theory changes. So your tournament strategy has to change with it. So now you might see some 6, 7, 8 in the lineup order, stack those guys, lower contrarian. Tournaments are all about finding value where other people aren't looking, on the chance that they hit and no one else has them. So I think in NBA, I'm personally fine with stacking. A stack that I kind of like is an example is James Harden, Trevor Ariza, and Dwight Howard. You have a ball dominant guard. You have Ariza who thrives in transition, hits open threes, can accumulate steals. And then you have Dwight who, crashes the glass and thrives in the paint. So it's 3 guys on one team. And like we talked about just a minute ago, some of these games that get into overtime, that's an example of kind of 3 guys on one team that aren't hemorrhaging points from each other. So there's a lot of value. And then Brian's wrote articles about, stacking Durant with Westbrook. And some of these high spread games can pay off big time, where, Westbrook might be 55% on, Durant might be 60% on, but together they're only 20% on. So you're getting a lot of value in kind of taking the contrarian route and combining players on the same team.
All right, guys, great stuff. Let's circle around the table one more time. Any closing words of wisdom for those taking the NBA plunge? John, let's start with you.
Learn how to write, kids.
Fantastic. And that's exactly what I would have expected. Jay.
I can't follow that up. I mean, that's incredible. My words of wisdom are just really to understand that there is variance, a lot of variance in NBA on a nightly basis, and it's a really difficult sport to kind of get the grasp of. It's a true grind. I think it's the biggest grind in DFS of all the sports that we have. So I think it's if you're just getting into it, especially from NFL, where you see NFL information, on TV 24/7, it's everywhere. So I think it's a big difference from that as far as the transition that, you kind of got to put a little bit more time in, but that's what we're here for, to help you with.
Yeah, I hear you. Got to mind the grind. Raybon, closing thoughts.
One thing that we haven't really discussed, recent play makes a lot more of a difference than the NBA. If a player is hot, it's a lot better to play him than it would be in the NFL, where things are just very variable based on touchdowns. Don't overestimate back-to-backs, and make sure that you're around in those last 15 minutes before lineup lock. That's crucial, because a lot of bombs can be dropped that can change your whole lineup construction in those last 15 minutes. So be around. If you have a job, be prepared to stay late and sitting at your desk, or make sure you get home, make sure you're not in your car or something like that, because we don't want you texting, and we don't want you DraftKingsing and driving or getting into any accidents or anything like that.
All right, brofos, if I may. That was beyond fantastic. It was fantasy-tastic. All right, Jay and John, thank you two for being on the show. Of course, you can follow them on Twitter at DoppelSykes and not Jay Daigle, and you can read their work at FantasyLabs. And, of course, thanks to special guest Chris Raybon at Chris Raybon, and you can find him at 4for4.com in the DFS MVP podcast. And I think that is going to do it for this inaugural episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.